Sometimes the past finds you when you least expect it. For Dellaney Rusk, it came in the form of a wild donkey crashing through her mountain pasture at dawn. She'd spent 40 years alone up there, needing no one and bothering no one. But this animal was different, frantic, and out of place. When it nearly destroyed her water pump, she had to track where it came from. What she found changed everything. An abandoned homestead on the far ridge. Old journals, photographs of people she'd never met but somehow recognized. And buried underneath it all, a secret that had been waiting 4 decades to surface. What could a wild donkey possibly reveal about a woman who disappeared into the mountains? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain had a way of making you honest with yourself. Dellaney Rusk had learned that truth over 40 years of living alone at 7,000 feet, where the air was thin and the silence was thick enough to wrap around your shoulders like a wool blanket. She'd built her life here one stone at a time, one fence post driven deep, one season endured after another, until the rhythm of it became as natural as breathing. Her homestead sat in a small valley between 2 ridges, protected from the worst of the winter winds, but exposed enough to catch the morning sun. The cabin she'd built herself 16 by 20 feet of hand-hewn logs, chinked with moss and clay. The roof was tin, salvaged from an old barn she'd found collapsed in a meadow 15 miles south. It made music when it rained, a drumming that had lulled her to sleep more nights than she could count. She rose before dawn every morning, had done so for as long as she could remember. The habit came from necessity at first. There was always work to do, and daylight was precious, but over the years it had become something else, a meditation. A way of greeting the world on her own terms before the day could make demands of her. This particular morning was no different. She woke to darkness, lit the kerosene lamp beside her bed, and dressed in layers against the October cold. Wool socks first, then canvas pants worn soft at the knees. A flannel shirt that had been her father's, not her real father, but the man who'd raised her in the foster system until she was old enough to leave. She'd kept it all these years, though she couldn't say exactly why. 2 sweaters over that, and finally her work coat, a heavy canvas jacket with a sheepskin collar that had seen her through more winters than she could count on both hands. The cabin was cold. She'd let the fire die overnight to save wood. Winter was coming, and she needed to be careful with her supply. She stirred the ashes, added kindling, blew gently until flame caught. The ritual was practiced, efficient. Within minutes she had coffee brewing in an old enamel pot, the smell of it filling the small space with something like comfort. While the coffee heated, she pulled on her boots and stepped outside to check the thermometer nailed to the porch post. 32 degrees. Right at freezing. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that particular shade of deep blue that came just before sunrise. Stars still visible overhead, sharp and cold. Her property spread out before her in the growing light. 15 acres of mixed meadow and forest, with a creek running through the eastern edge. She'd fenced 3 acres for a garden and pasture, though she kept no livestock anymore. Used to have chickens, even a milk cow for a few years, but they required too much attention, too much commitment. At 62, she'd simplified her life down to its essential elements. The garden gave her vegetables through summer and fall. She canned and dried enough to last through winter. She hunted deer when she could, fished the creek, and once a month made the long trip down the mountain to the small town of Pinewood for supplies she couldn't produce herself. Flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, lamp oil, salt, the necessities. She didn't need much else. The water pump sat 30 yards from the cabin, a hand pump over a deep well she'd dug herself that first year. It had taken her 3 months, working through the hard pan and rock, but she'd hit water at 40 feet and never regretted the effort. Good, cold water that tasted clean and never ran dry, even in the driest summers. She filled a bucket at the pump, her breath making clouds in the cold air, and carried it back to the cabin. The coffee was ready. She poured a cup and stood on the porch, watching the light grow, listening to the morning sounds. A raven called from the pine trees. Wind moved through the high branches. Somewhere far off, an elk bugled late in the season for it, but you heard strange things in the mountains sometimes. Dellaney had come here at 22, running from something she could barely name, a failed relationship, a job she hated, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She'd heard about this place from a man in a bar in Denver, a prospector who'd worked claims in these mountains back in the 50s. He'd drawn her a map on a cocktail napkin, told her there were still parcels of public land you could claim if you were willing to work for it. She'd driven up the next week with everything she owned in a Chevy pickup that burned oil and rattled like it was held together with wire and prayer. She'd filed her claim, bought materials with money saved from 3 years of waitressing, and started building. The first winter had nearly killed her. She'd underestimated everything, how much wood she'd need, how hard the cold would be, how completely the isolation would settle into her bones. She'd almost left a dozen times, but something kept her there. Some stubborn part of her that needed to prove she could do this, that she could survive on her own terms. And she had. 40 years. She'd seen the seasons turn 160 times, watched the aspens leaf out in spring and burn gold in fall, felt the first snow and the last. Buried 3 dogs over the years, their graves marked with stones near the creek. She'd broken bones and mended them herself, survived 2 bouts of pneumonia with nothing but herbs and stubbornness. Watched the town below grow and change while she stayed the same, unchanging, a fixture on the mountain like the granite outcrops and ancient pines. People in town knew of her, though few knew her. The hermit woman. The mountain witch, some of the younger folks called her, not unkindly. She traded venison and herbs for supplies, spoke little, and left quickly. There was a doctor named Pritchard who'd once hiked up to check on her after she hadn't been seen for 6 months. She'd sent him away politely but firmly. She didn't need checking on. She had one neighbor, if you could call him that. Vernon Hastings lived 5 miles north, an old prospector who'd been in these mountains even longer than she had. They saw each other maybe twice a year, exchanged a few words, helped each other when there was need. Last winter she'd found him with a broken leg and splintered it, helped him back to his cabin. He'd repaid the favor by bringing her fresh meat during a particularly hard stretch. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. That was the life she'd built. Simple, solitary, sufficient. She finished her coffee as the sun crested the eastern ridge, spilling gold across the meadow. Time to check the fence line, see if any of the posts had loosened in the last rain. Then she needed to split more wood. The pile was getting low, and November was going to come hard this year. She could feel it in the way the animals were behaving, the thickness of the moss on the north side of the trees. She was rinsing her cup when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a braying, harsh, desperate, full of panic. It came from the direction of the pasture, and it was followed by the thunder of hooves and the crash of something heavy hitting wood. Dellaney set down the cup and moved quickly, grabbing her rifle from beside the door more out of habit than expectation. Bears sometimes came through, but they didn't sound like that. Elk didn't sound like that. Nothing she knew sounded like that. She came around the corner of the cabin and stopped cold. In her pasture, tearing through the space like something possessed, was a donkey. Not a wild burro, she knew the difference. This was a domestic donkey, grey with a darker stripe down its back, but it moved like prey with a predator on its heels. It was thin, ribs showing, coat rough and matted, and it was terrified. As she watched, it charged straight at the water pump, veered at the last second, its hindquarters slamming into the wooden housing hard enough to crack timber. The pump shuddered but held. Dellaney's jaw tightened. That pump was her lifeline. She'd built it herself, maintained it for 40 years. If this animal destroyed it, the donkey wheeled and charged again, eyes rolling white, mouth open in another of those terrible brays. She had to stop it. had to get it out of her pasture before it did real damage. But the animal was beyond reason, beyond approach. She could see that from here. Dellaney stood there, rifle in hand but useless for this situation, and watched the donkey tear through her careful piece like a storm through still water. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that this was the beginning of something, that the solitude she'd maintained for 40 years was about to break open. She didn't know yet how right that voice was. The donkey finally exhausted itself. After 20 minutes of frantic circling and charging, it stood in the far corner of the pasture, sides heaving, head down. Dellaney waited another 10 minutes, watching for signs it might bolt again, then carefully climbed the fence and approached with slow, measured steps. The animal watched her come, but didn't move. Up close, she could see the full extent of its condition. Ribs prominent beneath dull coat, hooves overgrown and cracked, fresh cuts on its legs from crashing through brush. This was an animal at the edge of its endurance. "Easy," she said softly. "Easy now." The donkey's ears swiveled toward her voice, but it didn't retreat. She could see intelligence in its eyes beneath the fear. This had been someone's animal once, cared for, trained. Whatever had happened to bring it to this state hadn't been quick. She didn't try to touch it. Instead, she backed away slowly and returned to the cabin. She filled a bucket with water and another with some oats she kept for the deer that sometimes came through. She left both inside the fence, far enough from the donkey that it wouldn't feel threatened. Then she inspected the pump. The housing was cracked where the donkey had hit it, but the mechanism itself seemed intact. She worked the handle, water came up clean and cold. Lucky. If the animal had hit it straight on instead of glancing off, she'd be looking at days of repair work. Dellaney stood there in the morning light, looking at the donkey, looking at her damaged pump, feeling the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years. Anger, yes, but beneath that, curiosity. And beneath that, concern. Where had this animal come from? There were no neighbors close enough to keep livestock. Vernon Hastings had never mentioned a donkey. The nearest ranch was 15 miles down the mountain, and she'd never known them to run donkeys, which meant this animal had traveled far, or it had come from somewhere she didn't know about. She should just drive it off. That would be the sensible thing. Let it be someone else's problem. She had enough to worry about without taking on a half-starved donkey that nearly destroyed her water supply. But even as she thought it, she knew she couldn't. 40 years of isolation hadn't made her hard, just careful. And there was something about this animal that pulled at her. The desperation in its movements, the sense that it was trying to get somewhere, trying to find something, or maybe running from something. She went back inside and added more wood to the fire, poured another cup of coffee and sat at her small table, thinking. The donkey would need time to calm down, to realize it was safe here. Then maybe she could get close enough to check for injuries, see if there was any kind of tag or mark that might tell her who it belonged to. And then what? Walk it back to wherever it came from? She didn't have that kind of time or patience, but she couldn't just let it wander off to die somewhere on the mountain either. Through the window, she watched the animal lower its head to the water bucket. It drank long and deep, then moved to the oats. A good sign. If it was eating and drinking, it had survival in it yet. By mid-morning, she'd made her decision. She would track where it came from, follow its trail back to whatever place had released it or lost it. If she found the owner, she'd tell them to come collect their animal. If she found nothing, she'd deal with that when the time came. She changed into her hiking boots, filled a canteen, and packed a small bag with basic supplies. The rifle went over her shoulder not for the donkey, but because you didn't walk alone in these mountains without it. She'd seen too many bears, too many cats, to be careless. The trail was easy enough to find. The donkey had come from the west, crashing through underbrush in its panic. Broken branches, disturbed earth, hoofprints in the soft ground near the creek. She followed it slowly, reading the signs. Seeing the story written in the forest floor, the animal had been running hard. Not the controlled movement of a creature grazing its way through the forest, but the desperate flight of something driven by fear or pain or both. Several times she found places where it had stumbled, fallen, gotten back up, and kept going. The trail led her up the western ridge, through stands of aspen and pine, across a small meadow thick with frost-killed wildflowers. She'd walked this direction before, years ago, but never with purpose. The land here was rougher, less inviting. Granite outcrops and steep grades that made homesteading difficult. After an hour of steady climbing, she crested the ridge and stopped. Below her, in a narrow valley she'd never explored, sat the remains of a homestead. The cabin was small, maybe 12 by 16, built from rough-cut logs now grey with age. The roof had partially collapsed on one end. What had once been a porch was now just a few rotting boards hanging off the front. Behind the cabin stood the skeleton of a barn, 3 walls still standing, the 4th fallen inward. And behind the barn, barely visible through overgrown brush, was a makeshift corral, fence posts leaning at angles, wire sagging between them. Dellaney stood there a long moment, taking it in. Someone had lived here. Someone had built a life in this isolated valley, just as she had built hers. But unlike her place, this homestead had been abandoned, left to the elements and time. How long had it been empty? 10 years? 20? Longer? And more importantly, had the donkey come from here? She made her way down the slope carefully, watching her footing on the loose rock. As she got closer, she could see more details. A hand pump similar to hers, the handle broken off. A garden plot, now just a tangle of weeds and volunteer aspens. A woodshed with its door hanging open, empty except for a few pieces of rotted lumber. She approached the corral first. The gate was open, barely hanging on one hinge. Inside, the ground was churned up recent disturbance. And yes, there were hoofprints, the same size and shape as the ones she'd followed up the ridge. So the donkey had been here, been kept here, or kept itself here. But why? And where was whoever had been caring for it? Dellaney walked around the property slowly, taking inventory. A root cellar dug into the hillside, its door rotted through. A chicken coop collapsed into itself. Everything spoke of long abandonment except for that corral. Those were fresh prints in the mud. Recent activity. She turned her attention to the cabin. The door was closed but not locked. She pushed it open carefully, half expecting it to fall off its hinges. It held, swinging inward with a groan of old wood. The interior was dim and dusty, light filtering through gaps in the roof and walls. She waited for her eyes to adjust, then stepped inside. The room was small, a wood stove in one corner, pipe still attached but the stove itself rusted through. A rough table with 2 chairs. A narrow bed frame against the far wall, mattress long since rotted away. Shelves that had once held supplies, now mostly empty except for a few. Broken jars and mouse droppings, and on the table, covered in a thick layer of dust, sat a book. Dellaney moved closer. Not a book, a journal. Leather-bound, the cover cracked and faded. She brushed off the dust carefully and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, old-fashioned in the way people used to write before computers and hurried text messages. The 15th of January 1978, the first real cold has set in, 20 below at dawn. Margaret complains of the drafts, but the cabin is holding. The baby is restless. Dellaney's breath caught. She turned the page, then another, scanning the entries. A life documented in careful script, a family living in isolation, struggles with weather, with supplies, with the harsh reality of mountain existence. She closed the journal and held it in her hands, feeling the weight of it. Someone had lived here, had written their days into this book, had eventually left or died, leaving everything behind, including, it seemed, a donkey. She looked around the cabin with new eyes, seeing not just abandonment, but interrupted life. And she knew standing there in the dusty silence, that she couldn't just walk away. Not yet. Not until she understood what had happened here. Dellaney spent the next hour exploring the homestead more carefully. The journal had changed things. This wasn't just an abandoned property anymore. It was a place where people had lived, struggled, perhaps died, and somehow their donkey had survived, wandering the mountain until it found its way to her pasture. The barn yielded little except evidence of the animal's recent occupation. Fresh droppings in one corner, a patch of ground where it had clearly been lying down, no feed, no water source nearby. The donkey had been surviving on what it could forage, drinking from the creek that ran through the property about 50 yards from the barn. She checked the corral more carefully. The fence was old, the wire rusted and brittle in places. The gate, as she'd noted, was open. Had someone opened it? Or had the donkey pushed its way through? Hard to say. But there was something else, a water trough near the fence line, and in it, the faint residue of recent water. Not much, and long evaporated, but enough to tell her someone had filled it within the last few weeks. Someone had been here, recently, trying to care for the animal, then leaving it behind. Dellaney straightened up and looked around the valley. The homestead sat at the bottom of a gentle bowl, ringed by ridges on 3 sides and open to the south. Good protection from weather, decent sun exposure. Whoever had chosen this spot had known what they were doing. She walked back to the cabin, the journal tucked under her arm. Inside, she made a more thorough search. The shelves held jars that had once contained preserved food, all of it long gone. A few rusted tools leaned against the wall. An old kerosene lamp sat on the windowsill, its glass chimney cracked. The bed frame held. Only springs, no bedding left at all. But beneath the bed, pushed far back against the wall, she found a wooden crate. She pulled it out and opened the lid. More journals, at least 5 or 6 of them, along with some loose papers and what looked like letters. And underneath those, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from the worst of the moisture and dust, were photographs. Dellaney sat down at the table and carefully unwrapped them. Black and white images, the paper thick and heavy the way old photographs used to be. The first showed the cabin as it must have looked when new logs still blonde with sap, roof intact, a woman standing on the porch with one hand shading her eyes from the sun. She was young, maybe early 20s, wearing a simple dress and boots. Her face was serious, determined. The next photograph showed the same woman with a man, both standing beside a pickup truck loaded with supplies. He was tall and lean, wearing work clothes and a hat pulled low. Neither of them was smiling. But there was something in their stance, the way they stood close together, that spoke of partnership. More photographs. The cabin taking shape, the barn being built, seasons changing in the background, and then, in what must have been a year or 2 later, a new addition, a baby. The woman held it, the man standing beside her with one hand on her shoulder. This time they were smiling, tired but genuinely happy. Dellaney studied that photograph for a long time. The baby was perhaps 6 months old, bundled in blankets despite what looked like a summer day. You couldn't see much of the child's face, but there was something about the image that made her chest tighten in a way she didn't fully understand. She set the photographs aside and opened the first of the journals from the crate. This one was older than the one on the table, starting in 1976, the 3rd of June 1976. "We've claimed the land. Margaret is uncertain about the isolation, but I know this is right. We can build something here, something that belongs only to us." The handwriting was the same as the other journal, neat, controlled. A man's writing, she thought, though she couldn't say why she was so certain. She paged through the entries, watching the days unfold. The work of building, the challenges of hauling materials up the mountain, Margaret's homesickness, his determination. The 20th of August 1976. The cabin is finished. Roof doesn't leak. Stove draws well. Margaret said tonight that maybe she can learn to love it here. I hope so. I can't imagine being anywhere else. The 14th of October 1976. First snow. Margaret is pregnant. She didn't want to tell me until she was certain, but I could see it in her face. A child. Here, in this place we're building, it feels like a promise. Dellaney read through the winter entries, feeling the cold and isolation through his words. They struggled, ran low on supplies. Margaret had difficult mornings, but they endured. The 2nd of April 1977, Margaret gave birth this morning. A girl. We're calling her... The entry ended there, the rest of the page torn out. Dellaney frowned and turned to the next entry, dated 2 weeks later. The 16th of April 1977. Margaret died yesterday. Complications from the birth, though I didn't understand until it was too late. By the time I could have gotten her down the mountain to a doctor, she was already gone. The baby is alive, healthy, but I don't know what to do. How can I care for an infant out here alone? The words were shaky, the handwriting less controlled. Dellaney could feel the grief and panic bleeding through the page. She kept reading. The 20th of April, 1977. I have to make a decision. The baby needs more than I can give her. I can't keep her alive up here by myself. No formula, no doctor, no help. I have to take her to people who can care for her properly. The 25th of April, 1977. I took her to the county office, told them I couldn't care for her. They said she'd be placed with a foster family, eventually adopted. I signed the papers. They asked her name and I couldn't speak. Let them name her. I don't have the right to name a daughter I can't keep. The entry stopped there. The next several pages were blank. Then, months later, a new entry. The 10th of September, 1977. I'm still here. I thought about leaving, but there's nowhere else to go. Margaret is buried on the South Ridge. The baby is somewhere down in the valleys, being raised by people who can give her what I couldn't. I work. I survive. That's all there is. Dellaney closed the journal slowly. Her hands were trembling slightly, though she couldn't say why. This man, this father, had lived here alone after losing his wife and giving up his child, had endured decades of isolation and grief, and somehow his donkey had survived him and found its way to her property. She looked around the cabin again, seeing it differently now. Not abandoned, bereaved. This place held so much loss, it seemed to press down on her shoulders like a physical weight. She should take the journals and go. Get back to her own place, tend to her own life. This history wasn't hers to carry. But she found herself reaching for another journal instead, needing to know how the story continued, needing to understand why this man's grief felt so familiar, so close to her own bones. The second journal picked up years later, in 1985. The entries were less frequent now, sometimes weeks or months between them. The man, she still didn't know his name, wrote mostly about survival, weather patterns, hunting success or failure, the slow work of maintaining the homestead alone. But occasionally there were other entries. The 3rd of March 1986. I saw a girl in town today, maybe 8 or 9 years old, dark hair, serious eyes. For a moment I thought, but no, it couldn't have been her. My daughter would be the same age, but I have no way to know what she looks like. No right to know. The 15th of December 1987, another winter. Sometimes I wonder what the point is. I could leave, sell the claim, move back to civilization. But this place is all I have left of Margaret, of the life we tried to build. Leaving would mean admitting it was all for nothing. The 22nd of June, 1990. 13 years since I gave her up. She'd be a teenager now, in high school probably, dating boys, worrying about grades and friends. All the normal things. I hope whoever raised her gave her a good life, better than I could have given her up here. Dellaney had to stop reading. She set the journal down and walked to the cabin door, needing air, needing space from the weight of this man's regret. The afternoon sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the valley. She'd been here for hours. The donkey. She'd almost forgotten about the animal that had brought her here. She should check on it, see if it had stayed in her pasture or wandered off. But the journals held her, pulled at something deep inside that she didn't want to examine too closely. She had been in the foster system herself. Different homes, different families, none of them quite right. She'd aged out at 18, gone to work, drifted through her 20s until she found this mountain. But unlike this man's daughter, she'd never been adopted. Never had a family claim her permanently. She'd always wondered why. What was wrong with her that no one wanted to keep her? She'd made peace with it, or thought she had, built a life that didn't depend on anyone else's acceptance. But standing here in this abandoned cabin, reading about a father who had given up his child out of necessity rather than choice, it stirred old questions, old hurts. She went back inside and picked up another journal, this one newer. The cover was less faded, the pages less brittle. She opened to the first entry. The 4th of January, 2003. I'm 68 years old, too old to be living like this. Vernon Hastings came by last week, said I looked poorly. Maybe I am. Everything hurts more than it used to. The cold gets into my bones and stays. There. Vernon, her neighbour. So they'd known each other, this man and Vernon. Why had Vernon never mentioned him? The 18th of March, 2003. I've been thinking about her more lately. My daughter. She'd be 26 now. A grown woman. Married, maybe. Children of her own. I could have grandchildren somewhere and never know it. The 2nd of May, 2003. I went to town and tried to find out what happened to her. The county office was no help. Adoption records are sealed, they said, even if I'm her biological father. I tried to explain, but they just shook their heads. Privacy laws, they said. Protection for the child. The 10th of May, 2003. I hired someone to search, gave them what little information I had. The date, I surrendered her. The county. It's not much, but maybe it's enough. The entries after that became sporadic again, but with a new thread running through them hope. This man had spent 25 years alone with his grief, and now he was trying to find the daughter he'd given away. Dellaney read, faster, turning pages, looking for resolution. Did he find her? Did they reunite? The 15th of September, 2003. The search came back with nothing, or rather, too much. There were 6 infant girls placed for adoption through that county office in the spring of 1977. Without a name, without more specific information, there's no way to know which one was mine. The investigator said I could try to contact them all, but what would I say? I might be your father, or I might not be. What kind of disruption would that cause in their lives? The 1st of October 2003. I won't pursue it further. It wouldn't be fair to them, to these women who have their own lives now. I gave up the right to be her father 26 years ago. I don't get to reclaim it just because I'm old and lonely. The words hit Dellaney like a physical blow. 6 girls. Spring 1977, she would have been one of them. She'd always known she was adopted as an infant, had been told she was surrendered by a single parent who couldn't care for her. But she'd never known more than that, never tried to find out. Her hands shook as she turned the page. The 12th of November 2003, I bought a donkey today. Sounds foolish, I know. But Vernon said I needed something living here besides myself, something to care for. The animal is young, sturdy, good temperament. I named him Jack. Simple name for a simple creature. So that was how the donkey came to be here, a companion for a lonely old man who'd lost his family and couldn't find his way back to the daughter he'd given up. Dellaney kept reading, watching the years unfold. The man's health declined slowly. He wrote less frequently. The entries became shorter, simpler. The 3rd of June 2010. Jack is good company. He listens better than most people. The 25th of December 2012. Another Christmas alone. Jack got an extra portion of oats. Seemed right. The 8th of March 2015. I fell yesterday. Couldn't get up for an hour. Jack stood over me the whole time, braying, like he knew I needed help. Eventually I managed. But it scared me. I'm getting too old for this. The last entry was dated 3 years ago, the 10th of April 2020. Vernon came by, said he's moving down the mountain. His daughter wants him closer. He asked if I'd come too. I said no. This is where I belong, where Margaret is. I'll die here when the time comes. Jack will be fine. He knows how to survive. After that, blank pages. Nothing more written. The man had either died or stopped keeping journals. But 3 years ago, that meant he might have died recently. And the donkey had been surviving on its own all this time, until something drove it from the homestead toward her property. Dellaney sat in the gathering darkness, the journal heavy in her lap. This man's story had ended here, in this valley, surrounded by memories and regrets. And his donkey Jack had carried on until it stumbled into her life. She thought about the photographs again, the baby in the mother's arms. One of 6 girls adopted that spring. She would have been one of them. Could have been that baby. The thought should have felt abstract, distant, but it didn't. It felt close, too close. She gathered the journals carefully, wrapped the photographs back in their oilcloth, and packed everything into her bag. She'd take them home, read them properly. Maybe she'd find a name somewhere in the pages. Maybe she'd learn more about this man and his lost family. And maybe, though she barely allowed herself to think it, she'd figure out why this stranger's grief felt so much like her own. Dellaney returned to her homestead as the sun was setting. The donkey Jack, she supposed she should call him now, was still in the pasture. He'd drunk all the water and eaten the oats. When she approached, he didn't bolt. Just watched her with those intelligent, wary eyes. "You're his, aren't you?" she said quietly. "You belong to that man in the valley." The donkey flicked his ears but didn't respond. Of course not. He was an animal, not a confessor. But something about saying it aloud made it feel more real. She fed him again, more oats and some hay she'd stored for the deer. He ate, slowly, methodically. His panic from the morning had burned off, leaving exhaustion in its wake. She could work with exhaustion. Exhaustion meant he might finally accept help. Inside the cabin, she lit lamps against the gathering darkness and spread the journals on her table. 5 of them, spanning from 1976 to 2020. A man's entire adult life documented in careful handwriting. She made coffee and began reading systematically, starting from the beginning. His name was Thomas Rusk. She found it in the second journal, written in an entry where he'd mentioned receiving mail at the general store in Pinewood. Thomas Rusk, living alone in the mountains, trying to survive his grief. Rusk. She turned the name over in her mind. It meant nothing to her. She'd been given the name Dellaney by her foster families, had kept it when she aged out of the system. Her birth name, if she'd ever had one, was lost to sealed records and bureaucracy. But 6 girls had been adopted that spring, and she was one of them. The thought kept circling back, no matter how hard she tried to push it away. She read through Thomas Rusk's entries, learning the rhythms of his life. He'd been a veteran, she discovered. Served in Vietnam, came back with wounds that didn't show, met Margaret at a VA hospital where she worked as a nurse. They'd married quickly, decided to leave the world behind and build something simple, something clean. The mountain was supposed to heal them. Instead, it took Margaret and left Thomas with nothing but memories and an infant he couldn't care for. Dellaney understood that kind of running. She'd done it herself, fleeing to the mountain at 22 with her own wounds, her own need for isolation. But she'd never had anyone to run with, never had a partnership like Thomas and Margaret, and she'd certainly never had a child to lose. She found herself studying the photographs again, particularly the one with the baby. The image was grainy, The face is small, but she looked at the child's features carefully. Dark hair, even as an infant. A serious expression, mouth set in a tiny line. She got up and went to the small mirror that hung beside her wash basin, looked at her own face in the lamplight, dark hair, now threaded with grey. Serious eyes, a mouth that rarely smiled. It proved nothing. Lots of people had dark hair and serious expressions. She was looking for connections that didn't exist, trying to make a story fit just because she wanted it to. Didn't she? She went back to the journals. Read about Thomas's attempts to find his daughter. The investigators report that there were 6 possibilities, his decision not to pursue it further. And then she found something she'd missed on the first reading. A loose page, tucked between 2 journal entries from 2003. A photocopy of a document from the county adoption office. She unfolded it carefully. It was a list. 6 names, all redacted except for first initials and case numbers. 6 baby girls, placed for adoption in April and May, 1977. The dates they were surrendered. The dates they were placed. Case number 1977-042, female infant, surrendered the 25th of April 1977, placed with foster family the 3rd of May 1977, April 25. That was the date in Thomas's journal, the date he'd taken his daughter to the county office and signed the papers. Dellaney's breath came short. She read the other entries. The dates were all different, 2 in April, 4 in May. Only one matched the journal entry exactly, case 1977A042. She'd been in the system. She knew how the numbers worked. The first 4 digits were the year. The letter indicated the type of case A for adoption. The last 3 digits were the sequential case number. She'd seen her own file once, years ago, when she was 18, and trying to understand why she'd never been adopted permanently. They hadn't let her see much, but she'd glimpsed the cover page, seen her case number. She couldn't remember it exactly. It had been over 40 years ago. But it had been from 1977, she knew that much. And it had been an adoption case. She stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward. This was absurd. She was making connections based on nothing but coincidence and wishful thinking. Lots of babies had been surrendered in 1977. She had no reason to think she was Thomas Rusk's daughter, except the dates matched, and the circumstances matched. And something in her gut, something deeper than logic, was screaming that it was true. She paced the small cabin, agitated, unable to settle. If it was true, what did it mean? Thomas was dead, had been dead for years. Probably. She couldn't meet him, couldn't ask him questions, couldn't get the confirmation she suddenly, desperately needed. And if it wasn't true? If she was just projecting her own abandonment issues onto a stranger's tragedy? She went back to the table and picked up the photograph of the baby, stared at it until her eyes burned. The woman holding the child, Margaret Rusk, looked tired but content. The man beside her, Thomas, had one hand on his wife's shoulder, protective, proud. They'd wanted this child, had been happy about her arrival. And then everything fell apart. Dellaney set the photograph down carefully and went to her trunk in the corner. She kept few personal items, but there were some things she couldn't quite let go of. She dug through old clothes and spare blankets until she found what she was looking for, a manila envelope worn soft at the edges, her file, or what little of it she'd been allowed to keep when she aged out of foster care. Just a few pages. Intake forms, foster placement records, medical information, and on the first page, in the upper right corner, her case number. 1977-042. The envelope fell from her hands. She stood there, frozen, while the truth rearranged everything she thought she knew about herself. Thomas Rusk was her father, the man whose journals she'd been reading, whose grief she'd been witnessing, whose donkey had crashed into her pasture and led her back to a truth she'd never known she was missing. She was the daughter he'd given up, The baby he'd surrendered because he couldn't care for her alone on the mountain. And 40 years later, she'd come back to the same mountains, built the same isolated life, chosen the same solitude he'd chosen. Like father, like daughter. Running from the world in the only place that felt safe. The irony would have been funny if it didn't make her want to weep. Dellaney didn't sleep that night. She sat at her table, the journals spread before her, reading and rereading entries as if repetition would somehow change their meaning. But the truth remained solid, immovable. Thomas Rusk was her father. Margaret Rusk had been her mother, if only for a few hours. She'd been born in that cabin in the valley, had drawn her first breaths in that isolated place. And then her mother had died, and her father, unable to care for an infant alone, had given her away. She tried to feel something about it. Anger, maybe, or grief. But all she felt was a strange numbness, like she was reading about someone else's life instead of her own. At dawn, she went outside. Jack was lying down in the pasture, but he rose when he saw her. She climbed the fence and approached slowly. This time he let her get close, let her run her hand along his rough coat, feeling the ribs beneath. He pushed his nose against her shoulder, gentle, seeking. "You knew him," she said quietly. "You were there at the end. You know what happened to him." The donkey's ears swiveled toward her voice. She stayed there for a long time, one hand on his neck, feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality of a living creature that connected her to a father she'd never known. Eventually she went back inside, fed herself mechanically, and returned to the journals. She'd read. All of them now, except the last one, the newest, which appeared to have been written in the final years of Thomas's life. She opened it reluctantly, not sure she wanted to know how his story ended. The entries were brief, sometimes just a sentence or two. His handwriting had become shakier, the words harder to read. The 1st of January 2018, New Year, I'm 73. Never thought I'd live this long. The 25th of April 2018, 41 years since I gave her away. She'd be 41 now. Middle-aged. I wonder if she ever thinks about her birth parents. Probably not. Why would she? The 10th of September 2018. Vernon stopped by. Said I should come down the mountain before winter. Said I won't survive another one alone. He's probably right, but I can't leave Margaret, can't leave this place. The 3rd of December 2018. Jack saved my life today. I fell through ice on the creek. Couldn't get out. He came running, braying loud enough to give me something to focus on, something to keep me fighting. Managed to pull myself out. Oh, that animal everything. The entries became more sporadic. Months between them. When they resumed, Thomas's writing was barely legible. March 2020. I'm dying, can feel it. Not sick, just old, worn out. Been thinking about what comes after, about whether I'll see Margaret again, whether my daughter found happiness. Hope so. Hope giving her up was the right choice, even if it broke me. April 2020. Should write to Vernon, tell him about Jack, make sure someone takes care of him, but I'm too tired. Maybe tomorrow. There were no more entries after that. The rest of the pages were blank. Dellaney closed the journal slowly. So Thomas had died alone, probably in the spring of 2020, 3 years ago. And Jack had been there, surviving on his own, waiting, until something instinct, hunger, loneliness, had driven him to seek help, had driven him to her. She thought about that, about the strange symmetry of it, Thomas's companion animal, finding Thomas's daughter, bringing her back to the place where she'd been born. It felt like something out of a story, too neat to be real. But it was real. The journals proved it, the case number proved it. Her own instinctive recognition of the isolation, the patterns, the choices, all of it proved what she'd been too afraid to name until now. She was Thomas Rusk's daughter, and she'd spent 40 years living almost exactly the same life he had, in the same mountains, driven by the same need for solitude. The question was, what to do with that knowledge? She could ignore it, Bury the journals, return to her life, pretend she'd never found the abandoned homestead, keep living the same way she had for 40 years alone, sufficient, safe, or she could acknowledge it. Except that this lonely old man had been her father, that his grief and isolation had somehow shaped her own, even though they'd never met, that they'd both been running from pain in the only way they knew how. Dellaney stood and went to the window. Outside, the sun was climbing higher. Jack stood in the pasture, head up, watching the ridgeline as if waiting for something. She wondered what he remembered. If animals could grieve the way humans did. If he'd been waiting all this time for Thomas to come back, not understanding that his companion was gone, she made a decision. She would go back to the homestead. Not today, she needed time to process, to think, but soon. She would search it more thoroughly. Look for anything else Thomas might have left behind. Documents, photographs, personal effects. She'd learn as much as she could about the father she'd never known, and then she'd decide what it all meant, whether knowing changed anything, whether she wanted it to change anything. She spent the rest of the day on routine tasks. Split wood, tended her garden, fixed a section of fence that was coming loose. Physical work helped settle her mind, gave her something to focus on besides the whirlwind of revelation. Jack followed her, around the property, staying close but not demanding attention. She fed him again in the evening, watched him eat. He was already looking better, less frantic, more settled, as if finding her had been what he needed all along. That night, she dreamed of the cabin in the valley. But in her dream it wasn't abandoned, it was alive, smoke rising from the chimney, voices inside. She was a child, maybe 5 or 6, playing in the meadow while a man and woman watched from the porch. The man called her name, but she couldn't hear it. She tried to run to him, but her legs wouldn't move. She woke in darkness, heart pounding. The dream faded quickly, leaving only a residue of longing. For what, she couldn't say. For parents she'd never known? For a childhood that had been taken from her before she was old enough to remember it? She lay there until dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to the mountain silence. And when morning came, she rose and began preparing for another trip to the valley. There were more answers waiting there. She could feel it. She just wasn't sure she was ready for what she might find. 3 days later, Dellaney returned to the homestead. She brought tools this time, pry bar, hammer, work gloves. If there were more secrets hidden in that cabin, she was going to find them. Jack stayed behind in her pasture. He'd settled in, was eating regularly, putting on weight. She'd checked his hooves, trimmed them as best she could. He let her work on him without much fuss, as if he understood she was trying to help. The walk to the valley felt different now. She wasn't following a strange donkey's trail. She was walking toward her birthplace, toward the beginning of a story she hadn't known she was part of. The cabin looked the same as before, weathered, sagging, slowly being reclaimed by the mountain. But now she saw it through different eyes. This was where her mother had lived, where she died, where Thomas had made the decision that shaped both their lives. Dellaney started with the bedroom. She'd been through it before but hadn't searched thoroughly. Now she went over every inch, checked behind the remaining furniture, felt along the walls for loose boards, examined the floor for any sign of hiding places. She found the loose floorboard near the bed frame more by accident than design. She was testing the floor's stability, worried about rot, when one board shifted under her weight. She knelt and worked her fingers under the edge, prying it up. Beneath it was a space about a foot deep, and in that space was a metal box. Her heart began to pound. She lifted the box carefully. It was heavy, perhaps 2 feet long and a foot wide. The metal was rusted at the corners, but still intact. A simple clasp held it closed, no lock. She carried it to the table and sat down, took a breath, opened it. Inside were documents, carefully organized, some in plastic sleeves to protect them from moisture. She went through them slowly, her hands trembling. Birth certificate, hers, the original. She'd never seen it before. The adoption agency had provided a modified version, but this was the real thing. Mother, Margaret Ann Rusk. Father, Thomas James Rusk. Infant, female. Born 2 de abril de 1977. Location, home birth. New hospital, new doctors. Just Thomas and Margaret alone on the mountain, delivering their daughter themselves. And at the bottom of the certificate, a name, written in faint pencil, as if Thomas had filled it in but never made it official. Dellaney. He'd named her Dellaney. She had to set the paper down. Her vision blurred, and it took her a moment to realize she was crying. 40 years she'd carried that name, thinking it was something the foster system had given her. But it had been his choice, his first and last gift to the daughter he couldn't keep. There were more documents. Margaret's death certificate, cause of death, hemorrhage following childbirth, no medical assistance. By the time Thomas realized how serious it was too late to get her help. A marriage certificate. Thomas and Margaret married in Denver in 1974. They looked young in the attached photograph, hopeful, ready to take on the world. Land deed. The property claim. Thomas Rusk, 1,976, 15 acres in the mountains. And then, at the bottom of the box, wrapped in another layer of oilcloth, were more photographs. But these were different from the ones she'd found before. These were of her. Not the infant in Margaret's arms. These were later. Much later. The first photo showed a girl, maybe 5 years old, standing in front of a school building. Dark hair in braids, serious expression, clutching a lunchbox. On the back, written in Thomas's handwriting, "First day of kindergarten, got this from the county office. They said she's doing well, being raised by good people." Another photo, same girl, older now, maybe 8 or 9. School picture, formal pose, forced smile. On the back, 3rd grade. The office said there, "Not supposed to give me these, but one of the social workers takes pity on me. She's growing up, looks healthy." More photographs, a progression through childhood. Always school pictures, always with notes on the back. Thomas documenting the daughter he couldn't claim, tracking her growth from a distance, getting photos through sympathetic social workers who bent the rules. The last photo showed a teenager, 15, maybe 16. The serious expression had hardened into something more defensive, angry. On the back, high school sophomore. The social worker says she's in another new foster home, 4th one this year. Says she's difficult to place. Breaks my heart. I gave her up so she'd have a better life than I could give her. But maybe I was wrong. Dellaney stared at that photograph. She remembered that year, remembered being angry, being bounced from home to home, never fitting in anywhere. She'd run away twice, been brought back both times. Everyone said she was too independent, too stubborn, too withdrawn. They'd never understood that she wasn't withdrawing from them, she was just trying to find a place that felt right. And she never did. Not until she came to the mountain. She looked through the rest of the box, found letters unsent, sealed in envelopes addressed to her at various foster homes Thomas had written to her, had tried to explain, to apologize, to connect, but he'd never mailed them. Probably afraid of disrupting her life further, afraid she wouldn't want to hear from the man who'd given her away. She opened one of the letters, dated 1995. She would have been 18 then, just out of the system. "Dear Dellaney, you're an adult now. I could try to find you, try to explain what happened. But what would I say? That I gave you up because I was scared? Because I didn't think I could raise you alone? That I've regretted it every day for 18 years? You have your own life now, your own path. I don't want to burden you with my guilt, but I want you to know that I think about you, that I hope you're happy, that I never stopped loving you, even though I didn't have the courage to keep you. Your father, Thomas." The letters were all similar. Confessions, apologies, expressions of love for a daughter he'd never known. And he'd kept them all, locked away in a box under the floorboard, never sending them because he thought it was the right thing to do. Dellaney sat there for a long time, surrounded by the evidence of Thomas's lifetime of love and regret. But she'd spent 18 years being shuffled through the system, never finding a home, never belonging anywhere. And then she'd come to the mountains, just like he had, built the same isolated life, made the same choices. He'd tried to find her later, when she was grown. The journals said so. But he couldn't locate her because she'd moved so often, left no trail. And by the time she'd settled here on the mountain only 5 miles from his own homestead, he'd given up looking. They'd been neighbors for years, living parallel lives, facing the same mountains, breathing the same air, and they'd never known. The cruelty of it hit her like a physical blow. They could have found each other, could have connected, shared their isolation, maybe even healed some of the wounds. But timing and circumstance and bad luck had kept them apart until it was too late. Thomas was dead. She'd never get to tell him she forgave him, never get to explain that she understood why he'd made the choice he did, never get to know him as anything more than words in journals and photographs in a box. The grief surprised her with its intensity. She'd spent 40 years not missing parents she'd never known, but now that she knew who they were, knew their story, knew how much Thomas had loved her from a distance, now the loss felt overwhelming. She carefully repacked the box, placing the documents and photographs back in order. This was her history, her family, the only connection she had to people who'd shared her blood, and somehow, impossibly, Thomas's donkey had brought her back to it. Jack had carried the final message: come home, find the truth, understand where you came from. She locked the cabin carefully when she left, the metal box tucked under her arm. The walk back to her homestead felt longer than usual, heavier. She had answers now, but answers came with their own weight. Jack was waiting when she got back, standing at the fence, watching for her return. She went to him, rested her forehead against his neck. "You brought me back to him," she whispered. "Thank you." The donkey stood quiet, warm and solid, a living link to a father she'd never known but was learning to understand. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange suspension. Dellaney went through her daily routines, tending the garden, splitting wood, maintaining her homestead, but everything felt different now. She moved through her tasks with new awareness, seeing her choices through the lens of Thomas's life. She'd built this place the same way he'd built his. Same isolation, same self-sufficiency, same determination to need nothing from the world. She'd thought it was her own decision, her own nature. Now she wondered how much of it was inheritance, how much of who she was came from a man she'd never met, but whose patterns she'd unknowingly followed. Every evening she read the unsent letters. Thomas had written dozens of them over the years, documenting his thoughts as she grew up. They painted a picture of a man trapped by his own choices, watching from a distance as his daughter struggled through the same isolation he'd chosen for himself. "Dear Dellaney, you'd be 7 today. I wonder if anyone is throwing you a birthday party, baking you a cake, giving you presents. I hope so. You deserve all of that and more. I have nothing to give you except these words you'll never read. Happy birthday, sweetheart. Your father, Thomas." "Dear Dellaney, the social worker tells me you ran away from your foster home. They found you in the foothills west of Denver, camping alone with supplies you'd stolen. You were 12. Part of me is horrified. A 12-year-old child shouldn't be alone in the wilderness. But part of me understands. You were trying to find where you belonged. I did the same thing at your age. I'm sorry you inherited my restlessness. Your father, Thomas." "Dear Dellaney, you're 18 today, an adult, free of the system that failed us both. I went to town and asked about you, as careful as I could. They wouldn't tell me much, but I learned you'd left Denver. Headed west, someone said. Maybe to the mountains. If you came this direction, you'd be so close. We could pass on the trail and never know each other. The thought keeps me awake at night. Your father, Thomas. That last letter was dated 1995, 28 years ago. She'd been 18, just out of foster care, and yes, she'd headed west. Had spent several years drifting through small mountain towns before finding this place at 22. They might have passed each other, might have stood in the same general store, bought supplies from the same clerk, walked the same trails, never knowing. Jack had become her constant companion. She'd built him a proper shelter in the pasture, stocked it with hay. He followed her on her daily rounds, patient and steady. Sometimes she talked to him, telling him about what she'd found in the journals and letters. It felt less lonely than talking to herself, and somehow fitting. He'd been there at the end of Thomas's life. He deserved to know the rest of the story. On the 14th day, she made a decision. She needed to do something with this knowledge, this connection. Thomas was dead, but he wasn't gone. Not completely. He was in these mountains, in the cabin he'd built, in the journals he'd written, and most tangibly, in the grave where he'd been, buried. She'd found references to it in the last journal. Vernon Hastings had mentioned it in a brief entry. Thomas had told him where Margaret was buried, asked him to make sure someone knew where to find them both when the time came. The South Ridge, Thomas had written, under the largest pine. Margaret first, then me when I go. Dellaney had avoided going there, avoided confronting the physical reality of her parents' deaths, but now she felt pulled toward it. She needed to see where they rested, needed to stand in that place and finally, properly say goodbye to people she'd never gotten to say hello to. She packed a bag with tools, a hand trowel, work gloves, pruning shears. The graves would be overgrown after 3 years. She'd clean them, mark them properly. It was a small thing, but it was something she could do. The walk to the homestead was familiar now. She'd made it a dozen times in the past 2 weeks, each time finding some small thing she'd missed before. A carving Thomas had made on the doorframe, his and Margaret's initials in a heart. A child's drawing tucked in a book, something she must have made in foster care that a social worker had passed along to him. Each discovery was a gift and a wound, evidence of love, evidence of loss. The South Ridge rose behind the cabin, steep but climbable. She found a game trail and followed it up, watching for the largest pine. Near the top of the ridge, she found it a massive ponderosa, probably 200 years old, with branches that spread wide and thick, and beneath it, 2 mounds of earth, settled now, covered with pine needles and wild grass, simple stone markers at each head, rough granite, probably pulled from the mountain itself. The first stone had a name carved into it, Margaret Ann Rusk, 1952 to 1977, beloved wife and mother. The second, Thomas James Rusk, 1945 to 2020. He did his best. Dellaney stood there looking at those stones and felt something crack open in her chest. They were here, her parents. The people who'd made her, who'd tried to build a life together, who'd been destroyed by circumstance and cruel timing. She set down her bag and knelt between the graves, started clearing away the overgrowth, pulling weeds, cutting back the brush that had encroached. The work was meditative, giving her hands something to do while her mind tried to process. Margaret had been 25 when she died. Just 25. A whole life ahead of her, cut short by complications that might have been treatable if they hadn't been alone on the mountain. Dellaney tried to imagine her mother young, hopeful, pregnant with her first child. Had she been scared? Had she known the risks? The journals said Margaret had wanted to go to the hospital for the birth, but Thomas had convinced her they could handle it themselves. He'd blamed himself for her death ever after. Carried that guilt for 43 years until his own death finally released him. And here they were now, buried side by side, reunited in the only way left to them. Dellaney worked until the graves were clear, the stones visible, the ground neat. It took hours, The sun moved across the sky, shadows shifting through the pine branches, birds sang, wind moved through the high branches. When she finished, she sat back and looked at what she'd done. The graves looked tended now, cared for, as if someone still remembered, still honored the people resting there. She pulled a photograph from her pocket, one of the school pictures Thomas had kept. Herself at 10 years old, serious and wary, she propped it against Thomas's stone. "I'm sorry I never knew you," she said aloud. Her voice sounded strange in the mountain quiet. "I'm sorry we didn't find each other while there was still time. But I want you to know, I found everything you left for me. The journals, the letters, the photographs. I understand now why you gave me up. And I forgive you. I hope wherever you are, you know that." She paused, listening to the two. Wind in the pines. The sound was constant here, soothing. She understood why Thomas had chosen this spot. It felt peaceful. Final. "I turned out okay," she continued. "Not the life you hoped for me, maybe. But I'm here, I'm strong, I've survived. And I'm on the mountain, just like you. I don't know if that means something or if it's just how things worked out. But I'm here. And I'm going to take care of Jack. I'm going to make sure he has a good life for however long he has left. He's family, the only family I have now." The words hung in the air. She sat there until the sun started to lower, casting long shadows across the ridge. Finally, she stood and brushed off her pants. "I'll come back," she promised. "I'll keep the graves clean. I'll make sure no one forgets you were here, that you mattered, that you did your best, even when it wasn't enough." She gathered her tools and started back down the ridge. Halfway down, she stopped and looked back. The graves were visible from here, the stones white against the dark earth. She committed the site to memory, then continued down. At the cabin, she paused. She'd been thinking about this for days. The homestead shouldn't be left to rot. Thomas and Margaret had built it with their own hands, had put their lives into this place. It deserved better than slow collapse and eventual reclamation by the forest. She couldn't restore it, didn't have the time or resources for that, but she could preserve it, document it, make sure the story wasn't lost. She spent the rest of the afternoon taking photographs of everything, the cabin from every angle, the barn, the corral, the well, the interior, every detail she could capture. She'd print them, maybe make an album, keep the record of this place, this attempt at a life. When she finally left, the sun was setting. She took one last look at the valley, committing it to memory. This was where she'd begun, where her story had started before she knew there was a story to tell. Now, she knew, and knowing changed everything. The next morning, Dellaney woke with purpose. She'd spent weeks absorbing the truth, processing the discovery of her origins. Now, it was time to do something with that knowledge, something that honored both Thomas and herself. She went to her workshop, a small shed she'd built for projects, and selected a piece of pine she'd been saving for years. Good wood, properly dried, with straight grain. She'd never known what she wanted to use it for. Now she did. She spent the day carving. The work was slow, methodical, requiring focus and precision. She shaped the wood into a marker, larger and more permanent than the rough stones Thomas had placed. She carved carefully, making sure every letter was clear, every line straight. For Margaret's marker, Margaret Ann Rusk, 1952 to 1977. Beloved wife and mother, too soon taken, never forgotten. For Thomas's, Thomas James Rusk, 1945 to 2020. Father, survivor, keeper of faith. He did his best with a broken heart. She added a line at the bottom of Thomas's marker, something that felt right. And his daughter came home. The work took all day and into the evening. Her hands cramped, her back ached from bending over the workbench. But she kept going until both markers were complete, sanded smooth, the letters deep and clear. She treated the wood with oil to protect it from weather, then set the markers aside to cure overnight. Tomorrow she'd take them to the graves, install them properly, give her parents the monument they deserved. That night she reread the last letter Thomas had written, the one dated just weeks before he died. Dear Dellaney, I'm an old man now, dying slowly, like a tree in drought. I've accepted it, made my peace with most things, but I never made peace with losing you, with not knowing if you're happy, if you're safe, if you ever think about where you came from. I hope you don't. I hope you had a good life, a full life, with people who loved you better than I could have. But if somehow you ever do wonder about your birth parents, know this: you were wanted, you were loved. Your mother died bringing you into this world, and I gave you up because I thought it was the best thing for you. Not because I didn't want you. I've wanted you every day of my life. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to keep you. I'm sorry I was too afraid to raise you alone. I'm sorry for all of it. If there's anything after this life, I'll find your mother and tell her about you. Tell her what a beautiful baby you were. Those few days I had you. Tell her I named you Dellaney, like we'd planned. I'll tell her you survived, even though we didn't. That has to be enough. It has to be. Your father, always. Thomas Dellaney folded the letter carefully and placed it back with the others. She'd keep them all. They were her inheritance, not money or property, but words. Love expressed across an unbridgeable distance. A father's voice reaching toward a daughter he couldn't hold. She went outside, where Jack stood waiting at the fence. She'd taken to spending time with him every evening, just sitting in the pasture while he grazed or rested nearby. His presence was comforting in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Tomorrow we make it right, she told him. We give them proper markers. We honor them the way they should have been honored all along. Jack huffed softly, his breath visible in the cold air. October was giving way to November. Winter would come soon, hard and fast. She needed to finish this before the ground froze. She thought about Vernon Hastings, Thomas's friend, the one who'd been there at the end. She should talk to him, find out what he knew. He might have stories, memories, details that weren't in the journals, but not yet. First, she needed to finish this final piece, the markers, the graves, the formal goodbye. Then she could reach out, make connections, maybe start building something beyond the isolation she'd maintained for so long. Thomas had died alone, still grieving, still isolated. She didn't have to follow that path. She could choose differently, not abandoning her mountain life, but enriching it, opening it just enough to let in light. The thought scared her. 40 years of solitude had made her careful, guarded. She didn't know if she could change, even if she wanted to. But standing there in the cold evening air, with her father's donkey beside her and her parents' final markers curing in the workshop, she felt something shift, a possibility, a maybe. Tomorrow, she'd honor the past. And then, perhaps, she could begin to consider the future. Dellaney carried the markers to the homestead at dawn, Jack following behind her like a shadow. The wood was heavy, awkward to carry over the rough terrain, but she managed. This was important. It needed to be done right. At the graves, she spent an hour digging out spaces for the markers, setting them deep enough that weather wouldn't topple them. The old stones she left in place, they were Thomas's work, and she wouldn't remove them. But the new markers stood taller, more visible, more permanent. When she finished installing them, she stepped back to look. The morning sun caught the carved letters, making them stand out crisp and clear. Anyone who came here now would know who rested in this place, would know they'd been loved, been remembered. She knelt between the graves one more time, placed her hands flat on the earth, feeling the cold ground beneath her palms. I'm here, she said quietly. Your daughter. I found my way back, just like you hoped I would. Took me 40 years, but I made it. The words felt inadequate. How do you compress a lifetime of unknowing into a few sentences? How do you explain to the dead what it means to finally understand where you came from. I wish we'd found each other sooner, she continued. I wish I'd known to look for you. But we were both so good at hiding, weren't we? Both so determined to be alone. I get it now. I understand why you made the choices you did, Thomas. You thought you were protecting me, giving me a chance at something better. She paused, throat tight. I don't know if my life was better. Different, certainly. Harder in some ways. But I survived, and I ended up here, on the mountain with you. That has to mean something. A raven called from the pine above. The sound was harsh, lonely, fitting. I'm going to take care of Jack, she said. He'll live out his days with me, safe and fed. It's not much, but it's something. A way of paying forward the care you gave him. The care you wanted to give me but couldn't. She stood, brushing dirt from her pants. The graves looked complete now. Tended, honored. Thomas and Margaret Rusk, no longer forgotten, no longer just two lonely people who'd tried to build a life and failed. They were her parents. That mattered. Back at the cabin, she found one more thing she'd missed. Tucked in a drawer in the bedside table was a small leather collar. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, old, worn soft with use, and stamped into the leather, almost worn away but still legible, T. Rusk. Thomas's collar for Jack. She imagined him putting it on the donkey, adjusting it, making sure it fit comfortably, taking care of the animal that had become his companion in isolation. She slipped it into her pocket. She'd keep it, put it somewhere she could see it, remember. It was a small thing, but it connected her to Thomas in a tangible way. Physical evidence of his life, his choices, his love for a creature that depended on him. The walk back to her homestead felt different, lighter somehow. She'd done what needed doing, given her parents proper recognition, proper goodbye. The weight she'd been carrying since finding the journals, the weight of unknown history, had eased. Jack waited for her in the pasture. She'd left the gate open so he could wander if he wanted, but he'd stayed. When she climbed the fence, he walked over and pushed his nose against her shoulder. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on for a long moment. You're family now, she told him. The only family I have left. We'll take care of each other, okay? The donkey stood still, patient, as if he understood. Maybe he did. Animals knew things people couldn't articulate, knew loss and loneliness and the comfort of not being alone. She thought about the future. Winter was coming. She'd need to build better shelter for Jack, lay in extra hay. That was practical, manageable. Beyond that, she wasn't sure. Would she reach out to Vernon, connect with the one person who'd known Thomas? Would she go to town more often, stop isolating herself so completely? She didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in 40 years, she was asking the questions. That felt like progress. The sun was climbing higher now, warming the air slightly. She had work to do, always work to do on a mountain homestead. But she stood there a moment longer, Jack beside her, looking out at the ridges that surrounded her property. Somewhere beyond those ridges was the valley where she'd been born, where her parents rested. Where her story had begun, she'd found her way back. Against all odds, against all logic, she'd come home, and that changed everything. 6 weeks later, the first real snow fell. Dellaney woke to a world transformed, everything white and muffled. The kind of morning that made you want to stay inside by the fire with hot coffee and no obligations. But she had obligations now. She dressed in her warmest layers and went outside to check on Jack. He stood in the shelter she'd built for him, dry and comfortable, a thick layer of hay bedded beneath him. When he saw her, he brayed a greeting. She'd grown used to the sound. It didn't startle her anymore. She fed him, checked his water, not frozen yet, but it would be soon. She'd have to break ice twice a day once the real cold set in. The work of caring for another living creature. She'd forgotten what that was like, hadn't realized how much she'd missed it. Inside, she made breakfast and sat at her table with the journals nearby. She'd read them so many times now she nearly had them memorized, but she still kept them close. They were her connection to Thomas, to the father she'd never known but was learning to understand. On the table beside the journals sat the collar. She'd hung it on a peg near her door, but sometimes she took it down and held it, feeling the worn leather, tracing the stamped initials. T. Rusk. Thomas James Rusk, her father. She'd written to Vernon Hastings 2 weeks ago, not a long letter, she wasn't good at those. Just a simple introduction, explaining who she was and that she'd found Thomas's homestead and journals. Asking if he'd be willing to talk about Thomas, share memories. She hadn't heard back yet, but she wasn't worried. Mail was slow in the mountains, especially as winter set in. He'd respond or he wouldn't. Either way, she'd tried. That was what mattered. The snow continued through the morning, accumulating steadily. 4 inches, then 6, then 8. Dellaney split wood, stacked it on the porch where it would stay dry, checked her food stores plenty to last through winter, filled all her water containers before the creek froze solid. The rhythm of it was familiar, comforting. She'd done this 40 times before, but this year felt different. This year she wasn't just surviving winter alone. She had Jack. She had her parents' story. She had a sense of connection to something larger than her solitary existence. In the afternoon, she bundled up and hiked to the homestead. The snow was deep enough to make the walk difficult, but she wanted to check on the graves, make sure the new markers were holding up, that they hadn't shifted in the frost. The valley was beautiful under snow, pristine and untouched. Her tracks were the only marks in the white expanse. At the Dellaney graves, the markers stood straight and solid, the carved letters filled with snow that made them stand out even more clearly. She swept the snow off both markers, making sure they were visible. Then she stood there, breathing the cold air, watching the snow fall through the pine branches. "First snow of winter," she said aloud, "came right on schedule. You'd have been ready for it, Thomas. You always were ready. I got that from you, I think. The preparedness, the need to be self-sufficient." She paused, smiling slightly. "I'm talking to the dead now. Maybe I've been alone too long after all." But it didn't feel wrong. It felt natural. A daughter talking to her father, sharing the small details of life on the mountain. The fact that he couldn't answer back didn't diminish the connection. "Jack's doing well," she continued. "Getting fat, actually. I probably feed him too much, but I figure he's earned it. All those years surviving on his own. He deserves a comfortable retirement." The raven was back, perched in the pine above. It watched her with bright, intelligent eyes. She wondered if it was the same bird she'd heard before, or just another of the many ravens that lived in these mountains. "I'm thinking about going to town soon," she said. "Before the roads get too bad. Maybe I'll ask around, see if anyone remembers you and Margaret, see if anyone has stories. You lived here a long time. Someone must remember. It was true." She'd decided that morning, watching the snowfall. She'd go to town, talk to people, not hide anymore, not be invisible. She'd tell people about Thomas and Margaret if anyone asked. Claim her connection to them openly. It scared her, that thought. 40 years of privacy, of keeping herself separate. But Thomas had spent his whole life isolated, had died alone with his regrets. She didn't want to follow that path all the way to its end. She could choose differently, could honor his memory by living more fully than he'd managed to. By connecting where he'd withdrawn. By being brave enough to claim her story instead of hiding it. "I'll come back after the snow melts," she promised. "Keep the graves clear. Keep the markers maintained. You won't be forgotten. I'll make sure of that." She turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. She pulled the photograph from her pocket, the one of herself at 10, the one she'd left at Thomas's grave weeks ago. The weather had damaged it, but it was still recognizable. She replaced it with a new one, sealed in plastic to protect it from the elements. A recent photo, taken just yesterday. Her at 62, standing beside Jack, the mountain in the background. "That's me now," she said. Your daughter? Alive? Still here? Still on the mountain with you? The walk back to her homestead was easier, the trail broken now. Jack brayed when he saw her coming. She fed him again, even though he didn't need it, just for the pleasure of watching him eat, just for the companionship. Inside, she built up the fire and made coffee. The cabin was warm, the windows fogged with condensation. Snow fell steadily outside, building up on the sill. By morning there'd be a foot, maybe more. She sat at her table, looking at Thomas's journals. She'd write her own someday, add her story to his. Not for anyone else, just for the record. So if someone found this place 100 years from now, they'd know. A man and his wife had lived here, briefly and hopefully. Their daughter had been born here, given up, lost to the system, and 40 years later she'd found her way back. Had claimed her inheritance, not land or money, but knowledge, understanding, connection. It wasn't the life Thomas had hoped for her, but it was hers. And finally, completely, she understood why she'd chosen it. The mountain had been calling her home all along. She'd just needed 40 years to hear it. Outside, Jack settled down for the night. The raven called once more from the forest, and Dellaney sat in the warmth of her cabin, drinking coffee, watching the snow fall, at peace with who she was and where she came from. The past had found her, and in finding it, she'd found herself,